So we are making the case for the truth of Christianity as best we can. We are trying to defend our belief, our choice to trust in Jesus Christ as our Savior. And so our main thrust of our ministry is to present good reasons and evidence to believe that Christianity is true. What we did last semester in the spring was just spent several months making the case that there is a God. And now this semester, we're arguing that Jesus is that God. Jesus is that supreme being. And we're at the point in the argument now, and I'm going to give you the outline. There's some copies of the outline at your table if you want a little refresher. But I'm not going to do that tonight at the beginning. You can do it yourself if you'd like to look over the outline at your table. But here's where we're at in the outline. We're at the very bottom of the outline where we're asking the question, why should we think that the New Testament authors told the truth? And specifically what we're honing in on is their testimony concerning Jesus' miracles, right? That's what we want to know about. When they describe Jesus doing these miracles, specifically rising from the dead, why do we think they were telling the truth when they wrote those things? That's what we're focusing on in this particular argument. And tonight we're just going to jump right into it. So we're down to 5 and 6. The last few weeks we've gone through 1 through 4. Now tonight we're going to finish this argument by looking at 5 and 6. So number 5, we believe that they were telling the truth. One of the reasons we believe they were telling the truth is because their stories cohere with each other. Their stories cohere with each other. Now, you've probably heard a lot about differences between the 4 Gospels. The first 3 are called the Synoptic Gospels, then you have the Gospel of John. And you've probably heard a lot about the fact that there are differences between the 4 accounts, or the 4 stories, the 4 Gospels. But tonight, I'm going to make the case that those differences are actually a good thing. Those differences are actually a good thing in us being able to ascertain whether or not they were really telling the truth. Now remember, we're evaluating the situation very similarly to how lawyers, detectives, and judges evaluate situations like this. So maybe in the case of murder, there's several supposed eyewitnesses, and as a detective or a lawyer, we're trying to ascertain if these eyewitnesses are telling the truth or not. And that's the sort of methodology that historians, as I said, judges, detectives use when they're evaluating eyewitness testimony. And those are the sort of things we're going to be looking for when we evaluate the gospel writers, the New Testament authors. We're putting them on the stand, so to speak, to see if we can trust what they claimed. So one thing that detectives, lawyers, judges do when they compare stories from different eyewitnesses, if they encounter among the various stories large differences, then they know it's pretty obvious that they're lying, right? Or some of them are lying. If there's huge, large, even we could call them contradictions among the accounts, then a detective, a lawyer, judge is going to come to the conclusion that they're most likely lying. I'll give you a fun example of this. Perfect timing, considering we just had fall break. But usually how I tell the story is spring break. So let's say some college guys had spring break, and because it doesn't work in the fall, because these guys, they went to the beach, all right? I know for Nebraska, the beach is a long ways away. But let's say they did it. They went all the way to the beach. I don't care which one it was, but they left college for the week, and they went to the beach and had a great time. Towards the end of the week, they knew that they had to start heading back home. Classes were going to start again on Monday. So they had to start early, probably leave by Saturday to get back for classes on Monday. But they said, they thought to themselves, we're having such a great time, a group of 4 of them. We're having such a great time. Let's brainstorm a way where we could stay one more day here at the beach. So they came up with a plan. They said, let's spend one more day here at the beach, Saturday, drive home Sunday and Monday, get to class Tuesday, and then just tell the professor, look, we got a flat tire. I mean, what could the professor say, right? I mean, those things happen to people. Oh, I forgot to tell you, there was a quiz going to be Monday morning at class, okay? So there was some pressure to get back to class for that quiz. So yeah, they all agree to the plan. They think it's great, and surely the professor will let us take the quiz on Tuesday when we get back. So that's what they do. They get back to campus on Tuesday. They go into the professor's office, and they're like, oh, Dr. So-and-so, we wanted to be here for that quiz. We were looking forward to it all week while we were gone. But we got this flat tire. I mean, what could we do? But we're here now. Could we please, by your mercy, would you allow us to take the quiz this afternoon instead? And the professor said, sure, fine, no problem. I'm a reasonable man. I can do that. So they come back in later that afternoon for the quiz, and he separates them in different rooms. They open up their blue book, their test, whatever, and the first question on the quiz is, which tire went flat? So he got him. Because most likely they hadn't thought through that detail, and so they're going to say different tires, and then because it's a large difference, in fact a contradiction, he'll know that they're lying, right? So that's pretty obvious. If there's large contradictions, large differences, detectives, lawyers, judges will conclude that the eyewitness testimonies are lying. What's interesting, though, is that if there are no differences between the accounts, the lawyers, judges, attorneys also conclude that most likely they're lying. Now, why is that? Now, I'm talking about the stories being almost identical. The same sentences used, the same phrases, even down to the same adjectives and adverbs used to describe the situation. If the stories are that similar, what do you think is going on in the mind of the detective? What would you think they're guessing? Yeah, it's collusion, right? They got together and made up the story. It's just too similar. So actually what lawyers, detectives, and judges are looking for is that the stories would have differences, but there would be small, reconcilable differences. That's actually what they're looking for, and that's what would indicate the most that they're telling the truth. So small differences, not huge differences. Not something like there was one murder or there were 12 murderers. That would be too big of a difference. So smaller differences, and the differences could be reconcilable. They're not direct contradictions. And you can envision why people would describe the same story differently, right? It might just be the case that the different eyewitnesses have different backgrounds. We've got engineers in the room, and they would describe things that are pertinent more to an engineer, details, right? You might have artists who were some of the eyewitness testimony, and they would describe things more vividly, you would imagine, right? Colors and shapes and so on and so forth. So just because people have different backgrounds causes them to report different details of the situation. And different vantage points, lighting can look different depending on where you're at. I mean, even in this room, it's fairly dark back there, but fairly bright over here. And if somebody was seeing a murder take place on the stage and they were in the same room, but the lighting would look different from different vantage points, you can see how small reconcilable differences would happen. Well, this is exactly what we see among the Gospels. the New Testament authors. Small, reconcilable differences. But before we look at the Gospels, I want to show you a real-life example of this. Okay? This is a real-life event. It's actually a plane crash that happened in 2005. And I want to show you how, even from a recent event in our own history, how different people and news agencies even reported the event differently. But what we'll see is that there's small reconcilable differences among the accounts. Okay? So take a look. The first one is from the Associated Press, and this was their description of the event. Southwest Airlines Boeing 737 rests in the middle of Central Avenue. Saturday, December 10th, 2005 in Chicago. The jetliner, trying to land in heavy snow, slid off the runway Thursday at Midway Airport, crashed through a boundary fence, slid out into the street, hitting one car, pinning another beneath it, and a child in one of the vehicles was killed. So from this account, we know there were two cars, one boundary fence, and one child was hurt, killed even. Take a look at another report. Same event. Radio report. A snowy runway caused a Southwest Airlines Boeing 737 to skid off the runway in Chicago Thursday evening. Nobody on the plane was seriously injured, but a 6-year-old boy was killed as the plane skidded onto the intersection of 55th Street and Central Avenue and hit the vehicle he was traveling in. Now this account, notice the difference. Only one vehicle was hit, and nothing about going through any fence. So was there a fence? Was there not a fence? Third account, Reuters. Southwest Airlines plane from Baltimore, Maryland, sits on a road along Chicago's Midway Airport, December 9, 2005, after crashing through a safety barrier while trying to land during a snowstorm in Chicago on December 8, 2005. Now, interesting enough, this story doesn't mention that someone was killed at all. That seems like a rather pertinent detail. Talks about a safety barrier, not a wall. Was it a fence? Was it a wall? What was it? It also doesn't talk about any cars being hit. So were there no cars involved? You see small but reconcilable details. Fourth one. I think you guys are getting the point here. Southwest Airlines jet sits on a roadway after it crashed through a security wall the evening before at Midway Airport in Chicago, Illinois. U.S. authorities launched an investigation after the jet skidded off Chicago Airport runway and into a street where it hit two cars and killed a child. So now we got a security wall, not a boundary fence. Last one. This is from the same news agency, Associated Press. But notice, even it is different than their first report. Southwest Airlines Boeing 737 rests nose first at the intersection of West 55th Street and Central Avenue in Chicago Friday after it skidded off the runway at Midway Airport Thursday. So the second Associated Press source varies from their first one. It doesn't say anything about cars, no fence or wall. It doesn't mention anybody dying. So lots of differences, similar to what we see in the gospel accounts. Differences, number of things involved, maybe number of angels at the tomb versus number of cars involved in this accident. Very similar. Differences, yes, but small, reconcilable differences. You know, some people make a really big deal about these differences in the New Testament, but let's just focus here for now. We've seen a lot of differences just in these 5 accounts of this actual event that took place not too long ago, 15 years ago, in our own lifetimes. So because of these differences, should we doubt that this really happened? Should we conclude that we were lied to by the media? No, reporting, the point that I'm trying to make is that reporting is selective. And just because there's differences doesn't necessarily mean there's contradictions, right? And that's exactly what we see in the New Testament. Small but reconcilable differences. Now, I just want to look at one example in the New Testament, kind of a well-known example or something that's picked on quite a bit by skeptics, and that is the sign above the cross where Jesus was crucified. You don't often see that on crosses, right? Maybe at your church, or if you wear a cross necklace. Oftentimes there's not a sign nailed to the top of the cross. But according to the New Testament, there was a sign. However, the four Gospels say that there was something different written on the sign. So here we've got differences between the four Gospel accounts. Here you go. Matthew records that the sign said, "This is Jesus, the King of the Jews." Mark records the sign said, "The King of the Jews." Luke, "This is the King of the Jews." And then John, "Jesus of Nazareth," adds that detail, "the King of the Jews." So I think we could start, first of all, just asking, is this a large or a small difference? Critics might think it's a large difference, but I wouldn't consider it so. It seems like a small difference to me. Well, how about it being reconcilable? How could we reconcile this account? Clearly, this sometimes is speculative, right? To show different accounts can harmonize doesn't necessarily mean that you're correct in your theory of how they harmonize. But you don't need to. You don't need to be 100% accurate in your theory. All you really need to do is to show how it's possible they could record things differently. Does that make sense? In other words, you don't have to show the actual reason for the difference. All we really need to give is a possible reason for the difference. So, you could brainstorm for a minute and say something like, maybe this was the entire phrase. Maybe it was just the sign said this entire phrase, and then the different authors just chose to record different parts of the sign. That doesn't seem contradictory to me. By the way, it's not an error to summarize something, right? If I heard my pastor give a sermon on Sunday and the sermon was, half an hour or something, and you ask me later what the sermon was about, and I don't give you a 30-minute verbatim recording of the pastor's sermon, I just kind of summarize it for you, that's not an error, right? I'm not lying or mistaking. So if the gospel writers are going to summarize something, I don't think I would consider that an error or a mistake. I mean, honestly, even with Jesus' sermons, I think that's mostly what's done. Just take, for example, the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus' most famous sermon. It's Matthew 5, 6, and 7. 3 chapters. Most famous sermon of Jesus. Now you can sit down and you can read that sermon, Sermon on the Mount. It might take you 10, 15 minutes. Do you really think that Jesus preached 10-minute sermons? I highly doubt it. I would almost guarantee that the original Sermon on the Mount was hours long. And so a lot of what we have in the New Testament is a summary, a shortened version of the main points, if you will. But that's not an error. That's not a mistake. And if I summarize, my pastor's sermon from Sunday, and you heard the same sermon, and you provide your summary of it, there's going to be differences between those two summaries. Maybe even some huge differences, because he'll remember some things, or some things are more pertinent to him than to me, but that doesn't mean that they are contradictory, per se. Now, as I often say, I'm not a walking encyclopedia, so there's no way I would be able to come up, maybe during the Q&A time, if you bring up differences between the Gospels, I can, on the spot, maybe try to brainstorm how they can be reconciled. But a book that I would like to recommend to you, which does a great job at this, it's called When Critics Ask. And it's not just the New Testament, it includes the Old Testament, and it's laid out similar to like a commentary. So it begins in Genesis chapter 1, goes through Genesis chapter 2, all the way through the last chapter of Revelation. So it's very easy to find things. Let's say you're reading the Gospel of John, and you see something there that just does not seem right, or it seems like an error or a contradiction, or something just feels off. Well, you can very easily find John in here and the chapter you're reading and see if they address it. And it's a thick book, and they mostly address all of these supposed contradictions or problems. So I'll send this around. You can take a look at it. And if I get stumped during the Q&A, I might come back and grab that from whoever has it and look up how at least those authors have tried to reconcile the account. Now, there might be another way to reconcile this issue of the different sayings on the cross. Another explanation might be that the sign was multilingual. And this seems reasonable. We live in a multilingual society right now. Oftentimes our signs will be in English and at least Spanish and maybe other signs or other languages. And certainly in Jerusalem, first century, it was a multilingual culture. There were Romans there, Greeks. So it might have been written in multiple languages, and then the different authors or eyewitnesses just recorded maybe from the different languages. We know that Luke was not Jewish, so maybe he wrote or maybe he recorded one of the languages on the cross from that wasn't the Jewish or Aramaic language. Now let me read something really important here, because this can be confusing to those maybe Christians who are new to this sort of conversation, okay? So I'm going to say something right now, but I'm going to say it, hopefully I got your attention. I'm going to say it very carefully because I don't want to cause any confusion here, okay? So listen carefully. I'm going to read this. I might read it twice, depending on how good you pay attention. For the purposes of this argument, the argument we've been making for the last month, for the purposes of this argument, I am not claiming that there are no mistakes or errors in the New Testament. Okay? So for the purposes of this argument, I am not claiming that the New Testament is completely error or mistake-free. Now, I myself believe that there are no mistakes in the New Testament, no errors, no real contradictions. Okay, that's what I believe. I believe there are no mistakes in the New Testament. But I don't need that belief for this argument. I hope that makes sense. I don't need that belief for this argument. So I'm not going to be defending that belief tonight. I'm not going to be defending the belief that there are no mistakes, no errors in the New Testament. I'm going to defend my belief that that's the case next semester. We've got several lectures ready to go for that particular issue. But for the sake of this argument, I don't need that. In fact, that's not even what we're talking about in this argument. For the sake of this argument, I'm only claiming that the New Testament is historically reliable. Remember, I've said this before, but we're we're evaluating this situation with our historian hats on. We don't have our theologian hats on right now, right? We're not making a case for the inerrancy of Scripture. We will, but not yet. At this point in establishing the truth of Christianity, we're merely evaluating it for its historical reliability. Now you may be thinking to yourselves, well, can eyewitnesses be historically reliable if they have mistakes? If eyewitnesses have mistakes or real contradictions, can they still be historically reliable? And I would say yes, without a doubt. And I'll give you an example of this. It's fairly well recorded that when the survivors were interviewed from the Titanic, some of the survivors said that the ship, the Titanic, split apart and then both sections sunk. Some of the survivors from the Titanic said no, it sunk all in one piece. And then evidently under the water it broke apart, because then later, many decades later, it was found under the water to be separated. But at the time, when they were just interviewing the survivors right after the sinking of the Titanic, some of the eyewitnesses said it broke apart before it sank. Some said no, it stayed together and sunk as one. And you're probably thinking to yourself, now I saw that movie back in the 90s. What happened in the movie? Here's the point I'm trying to make. Clearly, one group of survivors was in error and one wasn't, because both couldn't happen, right? So certainly there's a contradiction there. One of them is just mistaken. So there are errors or mistakes in the eyewitness testimony, but the fact of the matter is nobody questioned whether the Titanic really sank or not. All sides agreed that the Titanic did sink. So yes, there might be contradictions or flat-out differences in eyewitness testimony that is still historically reliable. So, just to give you an example, even if Luke and Mark, John, Matthew, even if there are errors, even if there are flat-out contradictions, that doesn't necessarily mean they're not historically reliable. Again, I don't believe there are any mistakes or contradictions, but I'm not making the case for that tonight. The point I'm making here is that even if there are flat-out contradictions or mistakes, small ones, I mean, obviously if one said Jesus rose from the dead and the other one said Jesus didn't rise from the dead, that would be problematic. But it's like the sinking of the Titanic, right? No, they all agree Jesus rose from the dead, and that's the key point. Even if there are some mistakes between their small details of their account, that would not bother me in terms of this argument. I think we can still establish Jesus' resurrection and by that his deity by evaluating their historical reliability. I hope I was clear about that. I won't repeat it, but we're recording it so you can go back and watch it again if you so desire. Well, I'm going to turn over to you. I know I've talked a lot already tonight, but I'm going to turn over to you for a few minutes, and I want you to discuss this at your table. We like to do this at Rasha Christi at least a couple times every night. Give me a chance to be quiet, and you guys a chance to talk with each other. So here's my question I want you guys to talk about. If the New Testament authors' stories do cohere with each other, as I keep saying, small reconcilable differences, how much do you think this increases the likelihood they were telling the truth, and why? I'll let you guys discuss at your table for a bit. And move on to our sixth and final reason. There's more, but for the sake of this semester, we're just covering 6 reasons to believe that the New Testament authors told the truth. So let's take a look at number 6. And let me set it up with a picture, okay? A picture and a question. What does this say about the belief the beliefs of those who were flying those planes. Now, I don't think the fact that they were willing to fly planes and kill themselves in this way, I don't think that that tells us that their beliefs are true, but I think it does tell us that they believed their beliefs were true. You see the difference? Yeah, people die all the time for things that are false, obviously, right? But it's very unlikely that somebody would die for something that they think is false. Do you see the point? People don't die for things that they know aren't true. So if somebody's willing to die for something, a belief of theirs, that's fairly good evidence that they thought their beliefs were true. Now, if you consider the authors of the New Testament for just a moment, the authors of the New Testament were in a position to know if their claims were true or false, right? Because if they were false, if the things that they wrote and talked about were false, then they were the ones who invented those lies. You see what I'm saying? The New Testament authors were in a position, unlike these folks who killed themselves for their beliefs, the New Testament authors who were willing to die for their beliefs, they were in a position to know if their beliefs were really true or not. Because if they were false, they were the ones who made them false. They were the ones who invented them as lies. So, in other words, the point I'm getting at here, the sixth point, is that since the New Testament authors were willing to die for their beliefs in Jesus as God, gives us, I think, overwhelming, compelling evidence that they believed these things were true. Now remember what some people say. Remember, some people claim that the New Testament authors just made these stories up, right? These are just legends or myths. They made up these lies. But here's a question. If we're going to say that they just made these things up, would they be willing to die for it? You know, if you go back to the lawyers, judges, detectives, what we're really fishing for here are ulterior motives, right? What other motives could they have for making these things up? I mean, what would they gain there in Israel in the first century? What would they gain by making up this new religion? It's not like, things are today here in America. If you make up a new religion today, you can get rich, you can get famous. I mean, just look at what's happened over the last 100, 200 years. All the new religions have popped up and people can get very famous and rich. But in their context, obviously the gospel writers are famous today, right, 2,000 years later, but they had no clue, right, that they were going to go down in that sort of historic way. In their context, they were going to get anything but rich and famous. In fact, by standing up for their beliefs, they simply got suffering, rejection, persecution, torture, and death. So there's really, as far as I can see, there's no motivation here for them to make these things up. So this is, I think, maybe the nail in the coffin, if you will. I think this is a very, very strong reason to think that what they wrote, they believed was true. Because, as I keep saying, they were willing to die for it. And historians, look at this and just, they take Peter, just for example. Right? Peter went from being a coward, if we're honest, I think Peter would use those terms, He went from being a coward, denying Jesus 3 times, right, when he was arrested, and was transformed into this bold, courageous leader that was willing to stand up to anybody, and even in the face of death, stand up for his belief in Jesus Christ. And it just makes a very viable explanation of this change in not only Peter but the other disciples, was that they saw the resurrected Jesus. So this, specific case for the miracle of Jesus' resurrection among his other miracles, of course, is what this argument is getting at. So if you want the sources, these are early sources for all of the deaths of the disciples who were willing to die for their beliefs. So I'm going to turn over to the tables again, let you guys chat among yourselves for a while. This is the last, final, 6th reason that we're going to talk about, at least here this semester. There's more reasons. Some of the books I've recommended to you will give more reasons to believe the New Testament authors told the truth. But at least for this study, we've looked at 6 of them now. And so I want you to evaluate, talk among yourselves, this 6th reason. If the New Testament authors were willing to die for their beliefs, how much does this increase the likelihood they were telling the truth? And why? Why do you think that? So I'll turn over to you guys to chat for a while. Let me try to wrap this up now that we've looked at all 6 reasons. I want to just review with you real quickly this first argument. Because after tonight, we're done with it. We just finished point number 5. And so next week, I want to start with you on the second argument that we're going to make for believing Jesus is God. So here's the first argument, right? I think it's pretty good evidence that Jesus existed. Some people still question that at the popular level, but most all scholars agree that Jesus, the historical figure, really did live, existed 2,000 years ago. Sometimes people will question whether he himself claimed to be God, but I think good historical evidence we looked at that he thought of himself as divine. But the question, number 3, then becomes, why should we believe his claim? I mean, it's one thing for somebody to claim to be God, but why should we believe somebody's claim? A lot of people have claimed to be God. Well, I think what sets Jesus apart from other people who have claimed to be God is that he was able to do miraculous things. So it's really his miracles that provide that authentication, if you will. Authentication. We talked a lot. We spend several weeks making the case for the possibility of miracles. And I think the best way to do that is just present arguments that there is a God. We did that all spring. Because if there is a God, then we have to at least be open to the possibility of a miracle. Not necessarily believe every miracle claim we hear, but we have to be open to the possibility of miracles if there is a God. And then, when we hear of a miracle, I think it behooves us to look at the evidence for it. Evaluate eyewitnesses, so on and so forth. And that's what we do starting in point 4. Because we know mostly, and as we saw, mostly, but not exclusively, we know about Jesus' claim to be God. We know mostly, but not exclusively, about his miracles from the New Testament. And so that launched us into point 5, where we evaluated for several weeks now the historical reliability of these ancient documents. Do we even have an original, or do we even have an accurate copy of the original? Gave evidence to believe that we do. Not 100% accurate, but fairly close, 99.5%, according to Bruce Metzger. And then now we've spent 3 weeks making the case that not only do we have an accurate copy of the New Testament, but we have good reasons to think that they were telling the truth. So that's the argument number 1. A lot of details, but as I've been telling you, books and books have been written about this. Good resources for you at the popular level. Appreciate those folks. Break it down for us. but also good sources at a more academic, professional level that you can use as resources when you write papers, even at the University of Nebraska. And here is one of those. Every week I've been trying to share at least one of these sources. And this guy, to me, I just find incredible. So this is a figure, a man by the name of Simon Greenleaf. Maybe you've heard there's a university named after him in California. But Simon Greenleaf was a New England lawyer and a professor of law at Harvard University. I mean, in the law field, you can't get much higher than Harvard Law. He was a professor there, and one of the texts he wrote was used not only at Harvard, but many other places. This is the standard textbook on how to evaluate evidence in the courtroom. So this was something he was the expert at. And here's a book written by him. It's a very classic text, but he examines the testimony of the four Gospels as if they were presented in a court of law, which, as I said, he's an expert in. At issue then, he's passed away obviously, at issue then during his life, as now, the concern is the standards of evidence that Christianity should be judged by. Should we hold Christianity's truth claims to a higher standard than we use to sentence people to death? Now, as I understand his story, he started out as a skeptic of the New Testament, but after he evaluated it and all the history that goes along with it, using his skills and understanding of how evidence and eyewitness testimony works, he came to the conclusion, because of the overwhelming evidence for their truthfulness, that they were in fact telling the truth about these miracles, and so became a Christian. And the type of reasons why he believed they were telling the truth is the exact things that we've been looking at the last few weeks. The exact type of things that we've been looking at. So I'm going to close tonight with another opportunity for you to chat at your table. Now that we've covered all 6 of these reasons, I want you guys to discuss. I'll give you a good long while to do so. First, which of these 6 do you find to be the strongest? And which of the 6 do you find to be the weakest? The second question is, overall, do you think these 6 reasons together, cumulative case, do you think these 6 reasons make a good, compelling case that the New Testament authors were telling the truth?